Hmm.
Hi, everyone. We're going to start in 5 minutes.
Oh, wow. 5 minutes.
What do that?
I don't know if I'm doing it right.
Okay, I think we're going to start. Good morning, everyone. Good morning to everybody on Zoom and good morning to everybody on Facebook. My name is Sarah Levin and I am the Executive Director of JIMENA. I want to thank you all for joining us this morning, and I especially want to thank Matti Friedman for agreeing to talk to us all today. So I hope that you and your loved ones are safe and healthy and that we're all keeping our sanity, our distance, and our peace. So for those of you who don't know who we are, JIMENA is a nonprofit organization based in San Francisco, California. Our mission is to achieve universal recognition for the heritage and history of the 1 million Jewish refugees from the Middle East and North Africa and their descendants. Our programs aim to ensure that the accurate history of Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews is incorporated into mainstream Jewish and Middle Eastern narratives in order to create balance in attitudes, narratives, and discourse about Middle Eastern refugees in the modern Jewish experience. We operate through an education and engagement initiative and an advocacy program. So through this period of quarantine, we're leading a number of web-based programs. Our presence on the internet, our work and outreach on the internet is really nothing that's so new for us. So you can visit www.jimena.org, JIMENA.org, to learn more and to sign up for additional programs that we're offering. In a week from now, we have a great event with Rabbi Eli Abadi, who is also a doctor, and he'll be discussing COVID and what the Jewish and rabbinical precedent is for handling disease. So with me today is Sapir Taib, our program director. Sapir, can you say hi, please?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. And thank you, Matti, for being here and leading this session.
So throughout this Zoom session, Sapir, should I keep talking?
Yeah, 1 second. I will put the focus on you.
Okay. So throughout the Zoom session, Sapir and I will both be moderating. So in order to keep this an orderly conversation, we have everybody set to mute. And we do hope that you all have a lot of questions. If you do have a question, we're asking you to type it out in the chat box. So if you take your cursor and you go underneath your face, you'll see that there is a box that says chat. If you click on chat, to the right-hand side of the screen, a chat box will open. At the very bottom of this chat box, there's an area that says to everyone, type message here. Where it says type message here is where you'll want to type in your questions. So when Matti is done talking, Sapir and I will moderate a conversation and we'll select questions to have Matti answer. We're hoping to stick to topic today, so it would be wonderful if your questions could be relevant to the talk that he's about to give. So we're so lucky to have him here with us today. I think if there is a silver lining of this situation for cultural organizations like JIMENA, it's that we can bring people together from all over the world to listen and learn from top thought leaders and writers, artists, and musicians in their field. Matti is certainly one of them. Matti Friedman is an author and a reporter. His work as a reporter has taken him from Israel to Lebanon, Morocco, Moscow, and the Caucasus, and Washington, D.C. He is a former Associated Press correspondent and currently a contributor to the New York Times op-ed section. Matti's most recent book is Spies of No Country, The Secret Lives of the Birth of Israel, which won the 2019 Natan Prize and the Canadian Jewish Book Award for History. Pumpkin Flowers, A Soldier's Story of a Forgotten War, was chosen in 2016 as a New York Times notable book and one of Amazon's 10 best books of the year. His first book, the Aleppo Codex, which by the way is one of my all-time favorite books, not just on the subject, but in general, won the 2014 Sammy Rohr Prize and the ALA Sophie Brody Medal. 2 essays he wrote about media coverage of Israel for Tablet in the Atlantic triggered intense discussion after the 2014 Gaza war and have been shared on Facebook more than 130,000 times. There are few writers who have so effectively and compellingly brought the story of Jews from Arab countries into mainstream public consciousness. Matti is a true gift for all of us working on issues related to Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. So I think I'll start by asking Matti a few very general questions, the most general questions I could think of. And I encourage you all to chime in with your own questions throughout his talk. So Matti, thank you so much for being here with us today. If it's possible, I'd love for you to give a background about both the Aleppo Codex and Spies of No Country. What are these books about? And most importantly, why are the stories of Jews from Arab countries in the 20th century so important for us to hear today? Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for those questions. Can everyone hear me? Nod, yeah? I never know quite if this technology is working, but it's wonderful to be with you. I'm speaking from my room in Jerusalem, and it's amazing to be speaking to people who are all over the world. And I'm sorry that we can't meet in person. And I hope that at some point our paths do cross when this craziness is over. I'm just going to talk very briefly about those two books that you mentioned, the Aleppo Codex and Spies of No Country, which just came out. I'm going to try to keep it short so that we can have more of a discussion, less of a lecture and more of a discussion. I imagine that at least some of you have read one or both of the books, and I'd love to hear questions and comments about the books, and that'd be great for me. But I'm just going to kind of summarize them very quickly and try to explain why they're connected and what I'm trying to do with these two books, which are in some ways very different and in other ways similar. The Aleppo Codex, which came out a long time ago already, 2013, I guess, is a book about the most important copy of the Bible, the most important copy of the Hebrew Bible, which is called the Aleppo Codex. And as its name suggests, it was kept in the city of Aleppo. It was kept by the ancient Jewish community of Aleppo for about 600 years. It was kept in the Great Synagogue of Aleppo, and it has a pretty amazing story from the 20th century. On November 29th, 1947, as many people here probably know, the United Nations votes to partition the British Mandate territory of Palestine into two states, one for Arabs and one for Jews. And that triggers a series of events, which we're all familiar with. I'm sitting in the aftermath of that discussion, right, that decision right now here in Jerusalem. But it also triggers a series of events that isn't well enough known to, I guess, the mainstream population. I think it won't be new to the people on this discussion, but it triggers a series of riots that target Jewish communities across the Arab world. And these happen in cities from North Africa all the way to Iraq. And one of the riots happens in the city of Aleppo, and the Great Synagogue of Aleppo is burned. All of the synagogues of Aleppo, except for one, were burned in this riot that happens on November 30th, 1947, the day after the UN partition resolution. And in those riots, the Aleppo Codex, which is the perfect copy of the Hebrew Bible, disappears. And my book sets out to figure out what happened to this manuscript after it supposedly disappeared in November 1947, and try to figure out exactly what happened to it after that. And I got into this story with very little interest in the Jews of Arab lands. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I started out in 2008 as an AP reporter, just looking into the story. It's kind of an interesting, maybe archaeology story. I discovered as an AP reporter that one way to get out of covering the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is this kind of endless and repetitive story, one way you could get out of it was by covering biblical archaeology or stories about ancient manuscripts, which had a wide readership in the West. And my editors would let me cover those stories instead of doing what I was supposed to be doing, which is covering the main political story. So I decided I'd write a story about the Aleppo Codex, and I thought it was a story, a nice kind of heroic story about how Israel rescued a very important book and brought it home. And what ended up happening was 4 years of research that kind of sucked me into this incredible story of Jews in Aleppo, which is a place that I knew almost nothing about when I got into it. And it ended up being a story about a book, of course, but also a story about a lost world that was completely new to me, which is the world of Jewish Aleppo. The Jewish community in Aleppo, as some of you probably know, was ancient by the time the Second Temple was destroyed in the year 70 AD. It's one of the oldest Jewish communities in the world. Jews prayed continuously in the same place in Aleppo, the site of the Great Synagogue, from the 5th century CE until the 90s, which is when the last Jews left Aleppo. So we're talking about an incredible continuity and incredible depth of Jewish history and this Jewish world that I knew nothing about, because if you grow up as I did in a North American Jewish community. I grew up in Toronto, and the story that I knew about Judaism, and certainly the story that I knew about Israel, was a story about Europe. It's a story that starts with Herzl, and there are pogroms in Europe, and there's socialism and the kibbutz idea, and of course the Holocaust that all loomed very large in my idea of what Israel was. But then I came to Israel in 1995. I was 17 years old, and I discovered that those stories have very little to tell us about what the country actually is in the real world. The country is completely different from those stories, and if all you have are those stories, the real country of Israel makes almost no sense. And there's a lot that's going on there, but one of the main reasons for that discrepancy, for that kind of gap, is that only half of the Jews in Israel come from Europe. And at least half of the Jews in Israel right now have roots in the Islamic world, mostly the Arab world, and in non-Arab Islamic countries like Iran. And that is very much the story of Israel. If it's half of the Jews in Israel, then it's at least half of the story. And I realized that what I'd stumbled on with the Aleppo Codex was a different way of seeing what Israel is. And I wrote this story about the Codex, and I won't get into all of the dirty details, but it turned into this investigation about how this book disappears and then resurfaces in Jerusalem 10 years later, how it changes hands, how it goes from being the property of the Jewish community of Aleppo to being the property of the Israeli government, effectively. That's an ugly story, which is kind of interesting and in all kinds of dirty ways. And I investigated the fate of 200 missing pages of the Aleppo Codex, about 40% of that manuscript, which is arguably the most important Jewish manuscript. About 40% of the manuscript is missing, including the Torah, which is the most important part of any Bible manuscript. Those pages were stolen, and what exactly happened to them is very interesting, of course, and I looked into that. So the story was in some ways a journalistic investigation, but in other ways it ended up being kind of an elegy for a lost world and a different way of seeing Israel. And it sucked me into this world that had very little to do with the stories that I had about Israel when I moved there. The kibbutz and Herzl and the Holocaust had very little to do with it. This was about Jews who had always lived in the Middle East. And we call them Jews of Arab lands, but they were there before those lands were Arab. The Jews were in Aleppo before Aleppo became Arab. Talking about this ancient civilization that blinks out of existence in the mid-20th century, around the same time that Jewish Europe blinks out of existence. But we spend a lot of time as Jews mourning the loss of Jewish Europe, and we spend very little time thinking about what it means that there were 1 million Jews native to the Islamic world in the lifetime of my parents in the 1940s, and they're all gone. And we don't think about that very much. We don't think very much about what was lost. So that I learned from the Aleppo Codex, and I'm embarrassed to say that I thought about it very little before I got drawn into that story. And I came out thinking about Israel in very different ways. That's the Aleppo Codex. One of the main characters in that story was an old Mossad agent, a retired spy by the name of Rafi Siton, who is just an incredible character. If I made up that character, people would think he was ridiculous, because no person like that could actually exist in the real world. But he's completely real, of course. And I spent a lot of time with him talking about the Codex. He's a Jew from Aleppo, lived there until he was a teenager, escapes to Israel, becomes a spy, and plays a role in the story of the Codex. And in one of my conversations with Rafi, he mentioned to me kind of as an offhand comment that I could meet a friend of his, who is, someone's writing in the chat that Rafi is an amazing guy. That's true. He is an amazing guy. He said, I absolutely must meet a friend of his, a guy named Yitzhak Shoshan, who is an even older spy. He was almost 90 at the time. I didn't know exactly why I was going to meet Yitzhak Shoshan, but I've learned in many years as a journalist that if someone offers to introduce you to an old spy, you should go, and you're not gonna regret it, even if you're not sure exactly why you're going. So I got in the car and I drove down from Jerusalem to Bat Yam, which is where Yitzhak Shoshan lives. It's this suburb of Tel Aviv that is familiar to some of you, I'm sure. And I got to this building. It was a very kind of Soviet workers block of apartments like you have in Bat Yam. And I rode up in this tiny Israeli elevator, the kind of elevators that they built in the 60s. It's like the size of a telephone booth. You get into the elevator and you go all the way up to the 7th floor, and the door opened and Yitzhak Shoshan was waiting for me. And he was, you can't see how tall I am. I'm not that tall. And Yitzhak was much shorter than me. He's this tiny guy with a mustache and glasses. And he showed me into his apartment and he sat me down in his kitchen. And it's this tiny kitchen. in an old Israeli apartment, and it had these green tiles on the walls of the kitchen. And you might, if you've been in that kind of Israeli apartment, you know what I'm talking about. And he sat me down at the table and he made me black coffee. He kind of walked very slowly over to the stove. Again, he's almost 90 at the time. He walks over to the stove and he brews me black coffee using a finjan, which is this kind of tin pot with a long handle, which is how they used to make coffee in the Palmach, which is the pre-state militia in which he was a member in 1948. And he sat me down and told me a story about the founding of the state of Israel that was completely new to me. I'd never heard anything like it. I thought I knew a lot about 1948. I thought I knew a lot about Israel. At that time, I'd been here for quite a long time. I've been here in Israel for 25 years at this point, and I had never heard this story before. He described this small unit of spies that he was a part of in 1948 called the Arab section that belonged to the Palmach. I'd never heard of the Arab section. He mentioned a few other men who were with him in the section, his comrades from the Arab section, who were really heroes of Israel's independence and who really invented Israeli spycraft in many ways. I'd never heard of any of them. And I walked out of his apartment and I knew that there was something big here. Because when I walked out of Yitzhak's apartment after hearing this story about how Israel was founded, the streets of Bat Yam looked different to me. The country that I exited into after speaking to Yitzhak Shoshan looked different to me than the country that I had been in a couple hours earlier before walking into this interview. And he described, he told me a story about the founding of the state of Israel in which there were no Ashkenazim. The entire story was about Jews from the Arab world. All of his comrades were Jews from the Arab world. The main characters in this story did not come from Warsaw, and they didn't come from Vienna. They came from Aleppo. Yitzhak was from Aleppo. His friend Gamliel came from Damascus. Gamliel Cohen. His other friend Chavakuk came from Yemen. And there were Iraqis. One of them was actually Persian, an Arabic-speaking Persian. This was the Arab section, and I decided that this was the story I'd been looking for, because what I wanted was a story that allowed me to describe Israel with different characters. The main characters in the story that I wanted were Jews from the Arab world and not Jews from Europe. So I wanted for once to tell a story about the founding of the state in which the main characters spoke Arabic, were Jews who spoke Arabic. And I realized that what Yitzhak had just given me was this story. So it took me a really long time to put it together. This first interview with Yitzhak Shoshan in Bat Yam was in 2011. This was before the Aleppo Codex was published. He was really old, so I rushed with my digital recorder and I interviewed him again and again and again, and I got as much of him on tape as I could. He's still alive, by the way. So I was in a rush, but he had he planned on being around for a while. And then I didn't really know what to do with it. So I sat on it for a couple of years. Eventually I found that some of his comrades from the Arab section had recorded, he was the only one who was still alive of the main characters, but some of his comrades had recorded very long oral testimonies that someone had transcribed. That gave me a lot of material. The IDF archive, the Israeli Army archive, agreed to declassify a lot of files from the Arab section that were still secret. Bizarrely, 70 years after the events, the files were still secret, in part, I think, just because no one had asked for them. And I asked for them, and the classification was removed on not all the files, but a lot of them. And I suddenly found myself with enough material to put together basically for the first time, the story of the Arab section, which is a story about Israel's first spies. It's a story about how Israeli intelligence gets started, but what it really is a story about Israel's secret identity, which is that it's a Middle Eastern country that pretends to be a Western country, or a Middle Eastern country that really wants to be a Western country. But when you scrape the surface, or when you even just live here and walk around the streets and really look at the country, you see that this is a country that is Middle Eastern, not just because it happens to be a bunch of Jews from Europe thrown into the Middle East, but because the Jews here are from the Islamic world in large part, and that's reflected in every part of our culture, in the music, in the politics, in the food, in the way people behave, in the way we practice Judaism. Nothing in this country makes sense. You think of it as a European country. So by telling the story of these four very young men who come from Arab countries and are swept up into this incredible historical moment in 1948, that's what I'm trying to get at. And these guys are found on kibbutzim for the most part. They come here without parents. They're kind of street kids in many ways, and they walk up on the kibbutzim and they're hoping to integrate into Israeli society. wasn't called Israeli at the time. This is pre-1948. They want to be like the Slavic. They want to be new Jews. They want to be Hebrew warriors. They don't want to be who they were, which is kids from Arab cities. So on the kibbutzim, they changed their names. Yitzhak Shoshan, that's how I knew him. Yitzhak Shoshan, his original name was Zaki Shasho. That was the name that he had when he was a street kid in Aleppo. So he ends up on a kibbutz and he tries to be like the Sabras, and he changes his name to Yitzhak Shoshan, and he wants to fit in, but he can't because he's too different. And the kibbutzniks in the 1940s were, one generation, if that, removed from Eastern Europe, and they didn't know what to make of these kids who spoke Arabic and who seemed Arab and who had a whole different way of being Jewish than they did. So their attempts to assimilate into the society of the kibbutz fail. And just as they're failing to integrate, the Palmach arrives in the form of an intelligence officer whose name is Shimon Somech. That's his Hebrew name, but everyone calls him Sam'an. He uses an Arab name that seems to fit him better. He's a Jew from Baghdad, and he's running this operation called the Arab section. And what he's looking for is Jews who can pass for Arabs, people who can cross enemy lines and live on the other side of the line and fit in. So what he's looking for are these kids who are on the kibbutzim trying to be Sabras, but failing because they're too Arab. So he takes Yitzhak, like, listen, Yitzhak, we need you to come with us, but we don't want you to be Yitzhak. We need you to go back to being Zaki Shasho, your previous persona from Aleppo. He's taken to the camp of the Arab section, which is just a few tents outside of kibbutz, and he's given a third identity. Now his name is Abdul Karim Muhammad Sidki, and he is a Palestinian from Jaffa, a Palestinian Muslim from Jaffa. And under that identity, he's dispatched back into the Arab world, which is his native world. But now he's a spy, and now he has an assumed identity. And a few of these guys, including Yitzhak, otherwise known as Zaki Shasho, otherwise known as Abdul Karim Muhammad Sidki, are sent into Lebanon when the wave of Palestinian Arab refugees run away from Haifa in April 1948. There's a decisive battle in Haifa. There's a wave of refugees that flee Haifa to Beirut. The Palmach inserts a few guys from the Arab section into the wave of refugees, and they flee as refugees to Lebanon. This is before the founding of the state. It's a few weeks before the Declaration of Independence, and they experience the founding of the state as Arab refugees in Lebanon. And in fact, they experienced the first 2 years of Israel's existence as Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. And if you understand how much is going on in their story, you realize how wild the moment is, because these guys are Jewish refugees from Arab countries, or pretending to be Arab refugees from a Jewish country. And there's so much loss and displacement in their story that if you just think of them as Israeli spies, you don't really get what they were. What they are is something much more complicated. The word that they use to describe themselves, and I think I'll end here, the word that they use to describe themselves is a very interesting one. It's a word in Hebrew that many of you probably know. The word is mistarvim. That's what they call themselves. They don't like to call themselves spies. They think that's a dishonorable word. They don't like to call themselves agents. They call themselves mistarvim, which is a very unique word in Hebrew, which can't be really translated into English. The closest you can come to a translation is just to spell it out. The word means ones who become like Arabs. So there's actually a word for that in Hebrew, and you can conjugate that word in Hebrew. Listarev, mistarevet, histarev. It's a word in Hebrew. The action of becoming like an Arab is a word in Hebrew. That is very interesting and strange. And actually the word doesn't start with Israeli intelligence. These guys start using it to describe what they're doing as spies, but actually that word has much deeper roots in the lives of Jews of Arab countries. And if you look at Aleppo, again, you'll see that for hundreds of years in Aleppo, there were really two distinct communities in Aleppo. One is called Sfaradim, Jews who come to Aleppo after the expulsion from Spain in 1492, Sfaradim, right, Spanish Jews. And the other group of Jews in Aleppo are people who've always been there. They were there long before the Spanish Jews came. They were there before Jews came to Spain. They were there before Arabs conquered Aleppo. When the Arab conquerors arrive in Aleppo in the 7th century, they adopt Arab customs and they adopt Arabic, and they call themselves Musta'arabin in Arabic, Mista'arabin, ones who become like Arabs. So the word Musta'arifim actually has deep roots in the Jewish experience in the Islamic world, because of course Jews were always part of the Islamic world. There was never an Islamic world without Jews. And the word Musta'arifim has a lot to tell us about that, and it gets transplanted into the context of intelligence when Jews from Arab countries arrive, join the Zionist project, and find a home for themselves as spies. And the irony in their story is that the characteristic that made them useful as spies also made them outsiders in the state that they were trying to help found, because certainly in the early years of Israel, being a Jew from an Arab country wasn't good. That was a disability that you needed to overcome. The country was run by Jews from Europe, mostly Eastern Europe. It was run for Jews from Europe. No one had, among the country's leadership, had really thought about 1 million Jews from Islamic countries, and people didn't really know what to make of them. So that the Arabness of these Jews was a problem in society. It was a disability that they needed to overcome, with one exception: intelligence. In the intelligence world, this characteristic was appreciated. The culture was appreciated. The language was appreciated because it was all useful. So these 4 young guys find themselves in the only corner of the Zionist project at that time that valued who they were. And that has a lot to say about Israel in 2020, not just Israel in 1948. And I think if we really grasp who these guys were, and if we understand that half of the people in Israel, half of the Jews in Israel, are the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of these Musta'arifim, you get a lot about the state of Israel that you won't get if you just hear the official narratives about the country, about the pioneers and David Ben Gurion and Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan. Okay, that was maybe too long, but it's an intro to both of those books and kind of the way I'm thinking about Israel these days.
Hey, Maddie. So new to this. Hi, Maddie. I'm Rachel here. First of all, you can never talk too long, okay? I've been waiting for you for like 50 years. So I live in San Francisco. Yeah, I mean, 50 years in San Francisco, talking about Jews from Arab lands, talking about my family, talking, lone voice. So, this book of yours, I just have to say, I have bought at least 40 copies, at least, probably more, because I have a lot of friends. And
the best question I've ever been asked. So
and I just, send them out to just everybody. Just actually one went out in the mail yesterday. But question, A, what took so long? What took you? I mean, that is the question that keeps coming up for me. And the other thing that you meant, a new question, Musta'arifim. It was interesting because my dad, I'm wondering, do you know if this was a negative term in Arab lands? Because my dad sometimes is an Egyptian Jew, father's side forever in Egypt, mother's side Sfardim. And he would always say, yeah, some Jews, they just became like Arabs. And I'm wondering if it was a bad word in Arab lands among Jews.
They're 2 great questions. So just to address the first one, what took so long? That's a great question. I think that in Israeli society, in Hebrew, that discussion is being held. It's very much a part of the internal argument in Israel, or the internal debate in Israel. People are aware of, they're very aware of Mizrahi voices, and that's a big issue in Israel. And it has been maybe since, I would say maybe the early 70s is when it really breaks into people's consciousness with Black Panther protests, and the Black Panthers were largely North African Jews who kind of protest against the establishment. And it's very much a part of the way Israel talks about itself, although it hasn't really seeped into the founding myths of the country. And I think a lot of Israelis still think that Israel is basically a story about Europe. And European Jews invent Zionism and then found the state of Israel, and then are joined by a lot of Jews who came to Israel from Islamic countries. But I actually think that it's the opposite. I think that you can actually tell the opposite story, which is there were always Jews in Islamic countries. There were always Jews in the Islamic world. And in the 1940s, there were 1 million Jews in the Islamic world. And in the middle of the 20th century, the remnants of Jewish Europe transplant themselves into the Islamic world and join the Jews who were always there. And I think you can actually tell the story of Israel like that, but it means that the main character is someone else. It's not the usual people who are the main character. But I think that it's possible if we look at this country that we have today, where I'm sitting right now, I'm a couple hours from Damascus. I'm a couple, I'm not that far from Baghdad. This is where we live. We're in the Islamic world. We're formed in many ways by our contact with Islam. The Jewish population of Israel, in large part, comes from Islamic countries. The Judaism that's practiced here is very Middle Eastern. As I said, the music is Middle Eastern. The politics, in many ways, are Middle Eastern. And that's the country that we have. So who is the main character? Is it the Jews from Europe? I think that was probably true in 1948, but in 2020, it's quite possible that actually the Jews of Europe are less important to an understanding of Israel than the Jews of the Islamic world, which is not a comfortable way to think for many Israelis who are imagining a different country. And if you look at the founding generation and at many of the descendants, I think, of the founders, this is not what they wanted. They wanted Vienna on the Mediterranean, or they wanted a kind of socialist republic on the Mediterranean. And instead, what we have is something that looks a lot like Alexandria, like a much better version of Alexandria, or Beirut, which is a very cosmopolitan, Levantine place that makes sense in its context. And I think people are resistant to that. They don't want it. And that's why the official narratives have proven to be kind of impermeable so far to these stories, although it's changing. In English, it's even harder because the people who write stories about Israel in English tend to be immigrants from North America to Israel. The North American Jewish community is almost entirely Ashkenazi. So the people who would be writing in English are going to be Ashkenazim. Like me, my name is Matti Friedman. My family didn't come from Aleppo. And people have a tendency, I think, to write about what's familiar to them. And that's one reason that I've tried not to do that, because I think the big missing piece here is that. And I would love to see more people writing about it, including people who come from the background, in question. But everyone has to cover the country as it exists and have to cover the important stories. This is the most important story in my opinion, and this is what I'm trying to cover in these books that I mentioned. As for the word mistalvim, I think you're onto something. The idea that Europe is superior to the Middle East is an idea that penetrates the Middle East and penetrates Jewish communities in the Middle East. People want to be European. They don't want to be local. Being French is better than being Arab in the minds of many people. If you talk to people from Algeria, the Jews get French citizenship and try to kind of bind themselves to the colonial powers, which they see as a source of protection, maybe a source of advancement. I don't think they were wrong in that analysis. But you often hear a kind of disdain for the Jews who were more like Arabs. I don't know if they used the word Musa'arabin or Mistalvin, but there was definitely an attempt to get closer to the Sephardic identity. There's a reason that for a long time Jews from the Middle East called themselves Sfaradim, even though most of the Jews in the Middle East aren't Sfaradim. They didn't come from Spain. Their roots are much deeper than Spain. And again, not only were Jews in Aleppo before Jews came there from Spain, Jews were in Aleppo long before Jews ever got to Spain. In the first place, it's a much older identity. And I think it's one that should be embraced because it's, there's so much to be proud of. But the idea that you want to be close to Europe is very deep. And that explains the use of the word Sephardic instead of, something else. And that explains a desire to be kind of closer to Europe than to the Arab world. I'm not saying that I don't understand that impulse, looking at what Europe is and what the Arab world is. But I think there's definitely something going on there. I recently interviewed someone in New York, an artist, very talented guy whose family came from Morocco, and they were educated and they spoke French. And he was on the boat to Israel when they left Morocco and came to Israel in the early 1950s. And all of a sudden, all these people came out of the lower decks of the ship on deck. And he said he asked his mother in French, "Who are these Arabs?" And she had to explain to him, most of the Jews in Morocco didn't speak French. They spoke Arabic. He had no idea. So there's a lot of internal social dynamics that are in play, I think, in your question.
Yeah.
So there's a number of questions that are being typed in. I think the first one that's worth asking is, did these spies ever get any kind of recognition? Were they ever honored by the Israeli government for their service and for risking their lives for the state of Israel?
The simple answer to that, thank you for that question. The simple answer to that question is not really. There have been a few books written about the Arab section in Hebrew, not very widely read, out of print. You can't find them. These names are not famous. If you ask the average Israeli what the Arab section is, Hamchlaka Ha'aravit, that's what it's called in Hebrew. People have not heard about it. It's not one of the myths of Israel's creation. I think, getting back to that first question, because it just doesn't make sense in the stories that we tell about Israel's creation. The heroes of 1948 are what we call them in Hebrew, Yefei HaBlorit, the beautiful ones with this kind of pompadour hairdo that the Palmachniks used to have. And in our mind, these people are blonde. They weren't in real life, but in our mind, they were blonde and European and secular and socialist. And who are these Arabic-speaking traditional people who didn't come from far away? They came from 2 yards down the road in Aleppo in Yemen. So it just doesn't make sense, and it wasn't the country that they were imagining. So people didn't know what to do with them, and no, they weren't recognized, and people have never heard of them, which is astonishing and awful. And one thing that I'm hoping will happen now that the book is out in Hebrew, it just came out in Hebrew, is that will be corrected. Yitzhak, the guy who I interviewed, who I spent so much time with, still remembers his return to Israel in 1950. He spent the first 2 years of Israel's existence living under his assumed identity in Beirut as a Palestinian refugee with Palestinian refugees. They were in grave danger. About half of the spies who were active in the Arab section at the beginning of that war were caught and killed. And he comes back, they're extracted in the spring of 1950, and they're brought out from a beach in Beirut on a rubber dinghy, and then a small Navy ship takes them back to Haifa. And when they get back to Haifa, it's their first time in the state of Israel, because they left before the state was founded. They'd never been in Israel. And he arrives and steps out onto the dock, and he expects to be greeted by people from the Palmach. But there is no Palmach, because all the pre-state militias have been dismantled, and there's no one waiting for him on the dock. And he still remembers that. And this wasn't the guy who complained. He didn't have a chip on his shoulder. He was proud of the country. He was a patriot. He never forgot that there was no one waiting for him on the dock when he came back after risking his life for 2 years in Lebanon to help found the state. And I think that insult was very deep for these guys, and that although they claimed not to care about it, I think they did, and I think they were right to care about it. And I'm hoping that the publication of this book will be kind of a very belated correction to that missing piece of the story of 1948.
So you sort of just answered the next question that was actually asked prior to that, but we'll get to it anyway. So it seems like this perspective is consistent with white Western European narratives being the primary narrative we hear. Do you perceive this as well? And if so, do you have any thoughts on a way forward to shifting understanding?
Definitely. I mean, that's part of what's going on. And there are their responsibility can be allocated in 2 different directions for what's happened, or for the fact that so many people don't get this part of Israel. Not just people who don't like Israel, not just people outside Israel, but Israelis as well. There are two factors, I think, that are responsible for this misperception about Israel as a European country, or as a kind of colonial implant in the Middle East, which has always been absurd. And it's absurd if you know anything about the country, but it's a very wide perception of Israel. Part of the fault lies with Israel. With us, we always wanted to be European. And if you look at the posters that the Jewish National Fund used to use in the 1950s, it's a blonde pioneer with no shirt, hoeing the fields and listening to Beethoven in the evenings. And that was the ideal. It was never true, but that was never very representative, but that was the ideal. So we wanted to be European. Jews had just spent centuries in Europe being treated as swarthy Oriental foreigners, and they internalized that. They wanted to be blonde Europeans. That's what they wanted. The ideal of the new Jew, the Sabra, was a very European ideal, and we were happy to be identified as Europeans, because that was a big part of the Zionist idea. And so that's part of the problem, is that we always wanted that, and you can want it so much and tell these stories so much that you could forget that if you just stand on a street in Israel in 1950, in 1960, in 1970, or in 2020, that's not the actual state of Israel. The state of Israel has always been a pretty Middle Eastern place, and the Jews of Europe were also not really European. It was aspirational. My grandparents come from the worst part of Ukraine. They weren't on the Champs-Élysées, drinking, good coffee. The Jews were a marginal population in Europe. They were at the bottom of the social ladder in Europe, and they were treated as foreigners, not as Europeans. So that's one part of the problem, the stories that we've always been telling about ourselves. The other part of the blame lies with the Arab world, which has also always wanted to portray Israel as a colonial intrusion into the Arab world. And they do this for two main reasons. One is that it's a good way to play on the guilt of the West, which, as we all know, is a very useful tactic. If you tell Europe or the West, you are responsible for this, a lot of people will agree that they're responsible. So the story is, you Europeans, you treated your Jews so badly, there was a Holocaust, and we in the Arab world are paying for your sins. That's a very powerful narrative. And by the way, it's widely believed among intelligent people in the West. That's one reason that they push that narrative. But the other reason is that if you portray Israel as a project of white Europeans, then no one will ask what happened to the Jews of Aleppo and Casablanca and Damascus and Tunis, which is a very uncomfortable question for people from the Arab world. For example, if you've been to Cairo, I've been there a couple of times, there's a big swath of downtown Cairo, which is called Harat al-Yahud, the Jewish quarter. It's massive and it's completely empty of Jews. Where did all those people go? Where are all the Jews from the Jewish quarter? Every major Arab city had a Jewish quarter. Where is everyone? Where did they all go? What happened to their property? These are very uncomfortable questions, and they're solved by pretending that Israelis are white. Israelis are actually the former neighbors of the people from Cairo. It's the guy who ran the shop down the street in Fez, Morocco. It's the accountant from Baghdad. Those people are now Israelis, but that is very uncomfortable for the Arab world. But it's much easier to portray everyone as European. And I'll just give you one last anecdote about this that I love, which is that in Cairo, if you are there, you can visit the monument or the memorial for the greatest moment in Egyptian military history, which is the crossing of the Suez Canal on Yom Kippur, 1973. And there's this mural that portrays this. It's like a social realist, it's this wild painting that shows Egyptian soldiers forging across the Suez Canal and Israeli soldiers surrendering. And they're in all kinds of abject poses. They're raising their hands like this, and they're begging for their lives. And you can identify the Israelis easily because in this mural, the Israelis are blonde. And if you've ever seen a real Israeli military unit, you know that the Israelis are not blonde. And in fact, a lot of Israelis look a lot like Egyptians. And in fact, if you look at the soldiers who were on the Suez Canal in 1973, some of them were Egyptians. Some of the Israeli soldiers were Egyptians, but that is all very complicated and uncomfortable for the Arab world. So it's easier just to pretend that Israel is a colonialist implant, and you'll find that a lot of people in the West are willing to believe that.
Okay, so my internet dropped and I don't see the chat box, but I have one of the questions on my phone. So, hey, Matti, you wrote that now in current times, we take for granted that Jews in Arab countries had no future. So at that time, with everything going on, what did these communities think about their future? Were they optimistic that they may find peace staying in those Arab countries?
It's a great question because it took me a really long time to figure out what was going on in that regard. I was writing this book about the Aleppo Codex, and I'm trying to understand the decisions of the chief rabbis of Aleppo about what to do with this manuscript, because there's this riot in Aleppo in 1947, as I mentioned, and a fire, and the rumors say that the manuscript has been burned in the fire, when in fact it has been hidden in a textile storeroom in the old souk, in the old market of Aleppo. And the rabbis are trying to figure out what to do with this manuscript, and I couldn't understand why not just get it out of Aleppo? And it took me a while to realize they didn't think they were going to have to leave Aleppo. And why would they? Like, now we accept as just a fact that if the state of Israel exists, the million Jews who are native to the Islamic world will not be in their homes. That seems obvious to us, of course, and too many people think that not much was lost. Okay, so there are no Jews in Casablanca, they're all better off in Israel. There are no Jews in Aleppo, okay, big deal. But something incredibly old and rich was lost, something much older than the Jewish world of Europe. The Jews had been in Aleppo for 2,500 years straight, continuous Jewish presence. No Jew in Europe has anything resembling that. And they had been through Mongol invasions and earthquakes, and they'd been there under the Turks, and they'd been there under the Arabs, and they'd been there under the Romans. And why would they leave just because a Jewish state was founded in the British Mandate Palestine. It didn't make sense to them. Why? You know, they've been through so much. The Jews of Aleppo had always been there, always. There was no Aleppo without Jews. They were the oldest native population of the city. So suddenly I realized that they just didn't think that they were going to have to leave. And it took about 10 years before the chief rabbis of Aleppo. This is 1957, so 10 years after the partition vote in the United Nations, 10 years after the riot, Aleppo basically guts the community. 10 years later, they realize that the community has no future. And they decide that they have to send the Aleppo Codex to Israel. And that moment is, in my opinion, the symbolic moment of the death of Judaism in the Islamic world. There were legends about the Aleppo Codex in the Aleppo community. Maybe there are halabim on this conversation who know that the stories in the Aleppo community always said that the book could never leave the synagogue. If the book ever left the synagogue, if it ever left Aleppo, the Aleppo Jewish community would be destroyed. That was one of the main stories of the community. So, and I spent a lot of time for this book interviewing kind of elderly Jews from Aleppo, and they would say, yes, they told us this story that if the book is ever moved from Aleppo, the community will be destroyed. And of course, we don't believe any of that because we're not superstitious people. And then they would lean in very close and say in a kind of whisper, but it was true, but it happened because as soon as the book is moved from Aleppo and sent to Israel, the community has no future. And that decision by the chief rabbis of Aleppo, the two rabbis were Musa Tawil and Salim Za'afrani. They decide to send the book out of Aleppo, and that is an admission that there's no future for Jews in Aleppo and by extension in the Arab world. It's an incredible moment that's been, of course, overlooked, like the whole world has been overlooked.
So somebody asked if this is being recorded. So if you visit JIMENA's Facebook page, you'll find in the video section that we are recording all of our Zoom sessions that we're conducting right now, including this one, so you can watch it and share it through Facebook. Okay, so here's two questions that are somewhat related. Hi, Maddie, it's Greg. Mistar Levim units in the IDF, Border Police, and Shabak have and still are held in high esteem. Many of us who served in the IDF. With the success of FADA, do you think that there is now a cool factor about being a Mizrahi Jew? And then the second question is, what are your thoughts on other popular representations of Israeli spies? Do you think they are missing anything?
Those are great questions. When I speak to people about this book, about Spies of No Country in the States, I know to mention Fauda because that series has been so popular. And for those few of you who haven't seen Fauda, it's a modern day story. It's not an accurate story, really. It's a thriller. It's not meant to be, completely accurate, but it's based in this idea or this job that exists in the Israeli intelligence world, this job of mistarvim. There's a lot of fascination with people who can cross the lines, people who are one thing at home and then can put on a different shirt and walk across the line and be someone else. And the stars of Fauda are mistarvim. And that the subtext of the show, which I think is maybe lost on a lot of Western viewers, but probably not on a lot of the people who are on this conversation, is that who are the mistarvim? Who are these guys? They're Jews from families that came from the Arab world. So the pretense, it's not exactly clear what's the pretense. You meet in the second season of Fauda, you meet the father of Doron, who's the main guy. And it turns out that he's Iraqi, maybe Egyptian, but I'm pretty sure he's Iraqi. And he speaks native Arabic. And you understand that Doron's Arab identity is not exactly a pretense. I think that's very tricky for a lot of Western viewers. I don't think they necessarily get that because these are Israelis who are pretending to be Arabs, okay? But they're not exactly pretending. And in the story of my mistarvim, I'm very possessive of them. In the story of the mistarvim from 1948, that's a big part of what's going on in the story. They're taken to these tents and they're turned into mistarvim. But the question is, what are they pretending exactly? They don't have to be taught Arabic. That's their native language. They don't have to be taught how to live in Arab society. That's the society that they're from. So what is the pretense? Is the pretense that they are that they're Arabs? Or is the pretense that they're not Arabs? Are these people who are pretending to be Arabs? Or are these people who are pretending not to be Arab, pretending to be Arabs? There's a very blurry identity game that's going on in the story of those spies and in the story of the spies from Fauda. and in the story of the state of Israel, where half of the Jewish population comes from the Islamic world, mainly from the Arab world. So the idea that we're not from here and we are from here, I mean, there's so much going on, and it says so much about the country, which is one reason I think that Fauda is so interesting beyond the, the thriller elements and the violence, which I actually find hard to swallow. The identity games there are very interesting and much more complicated than I think is apparent to most Western viewers. I've managed to forget the second part of the question.
Oh, well, let's go on to the next question, actually. So do you think it's ironic that an Ashkenazi Jew is educating us about the Mizrahi Jewish experience? And how do you feel writing about these issues as an Ashkenazi Jew?
It's true, I am Ashkenazi. My name and everything about me gives that away. I look at it as coverage. I'm a reporter, so I cover the society that I live in, and I have to cover the actual society. I can't just cover my own imagination or my own imagined version of the society, and I certainly can't just cover people who are like me or come from the background that I come from. First of all, if I had to limit myself to covering Canadian Jews in Israel, the story would be very, narrow and not that interesting. So I think that everyone who's covering a given story has to cover everything about it. And I think that this is the most important thing about Israel. And I think it's very strange that there aren't that many people doing the story. There should be much more. It should be what everyone is talking about. But that's not the case. So I'm gonna do it. And of course, I would love to see more people write about every aspect of Israeli society. I would love to see Israeli reporters who come from, Iraqi families writing the ultimate book about David Ben-Gurion and the Jews of Plonsk. There's no reason for that not to be the case. I'm Israeli. I cover the society that I'm part of. A big part of this society comes from the Arab world, and I find that fascinating and important. And I find it kind of scandalous that it's been so underreported. And I feel great. And when I write, I feel great about covering this story. And when I write books or articles, chiefly what I'm trying to do is explain something to myself. That's how it always starts. What exactly is this place where I live? Why doesn't it make sense to me? I have to understand it. And I try to explain it to myself. And then I move to explaining it to other people. And what's interesting is that my job has always been to write about Israel in English, so I generally tend to think about writing stories that explain Israel better to people who live outside of Israel and read about it in English. But what's actually happened is that the stories that I've written about Israel have been interesting to Israelis in Hebrew, and all of my books have been translated into Hebrew, and I've found an audience in Israel among Israelis, the people who I live with, who also have found an interesting angle with stuff that I've been writing about. The book about the Arab section isn't just the first time that Americans are reading about the Arab section. It's going to be the first time that a lot of Israelis are reading about the Arab section. So I feel very lucky to have stumbled on something new and important.
So we have time for about one or two more questions. So I think this is a really interesting question. Matti, have you ever discussed these truths with noted American Jewish writers and journalists who are so critical of Israel's founding, such as Peter Beinart? And what is their response?
Sometimes I have had the opportunity, and I've moved in the world of the international press here for many years, although I'm not that popular there anymore. And if you've read some of my writing about it, you probably understand why. And I've never met Peter Beinart. Some people are interested in what the state of Israel actually is, but most people aren't. Most people, when they look at Israel, are looking for some kind of projection of themselves. And that's true of people who love Israel, and that's true of people who hate Israel. People are looking for some kind of blank screen onto which they can project their own ideas. And I just get that a lot when I read stuff about Israel, including from people who love this place. They love imaginary things about this place that don't exist. And a lot of people that hate this place don't know anything about it. They're just imagining things or projecting things that they don't like about their own societies onto this country as a way of discussing them. And that's a lot, I think, of what's going on in the discussion of Israel as racist or as an apartheid state or inequality and oppression. And that these are all issues that are obviously very important to Westerners, and they just project them onto Israel as a way of processing them. So in order to be interested in this story that I'm trying to tell, you have to care about what the country actually is. the actual state of Israel as it exists in this very small piece of land between, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. There's 9 million of us here in Israel, 20% Arab, mostly Muslim, 80% Jewish, basically half of those Jews from, of Ashkenazi background and half Jews of Mizrahi background, although it's getting very mixed because of intermarriage. And you have to really care about understanding what this place is and what makes it tick. Most people don't, most journalists don't, most experts don't. They're looking for something else here. And there aren't that many of us who actually understand the country, are trying to understand what it actually is. There's a remarkably small number of people who are trying to do that. So I don't get asked by a lot of the people you're thinking of, Matti, can you just explain this country to me? Because those people already know, they don't need anyone to explain it to them. They know it all from 8,000 miles away, and they get all the information they need from Twitter, and the actual mechanics just confuse them. They just muddy the story that they're trying to tell. So why delve into the complications?
I love that. Thank you so much for that answer. It's so important. That resonates for me and our work at JIMENA very deeply. Thank you. So I think we have time for one last question, and then we'll log off. But before I ask, I just want to thank you again for taking the time to do this. Matti is quarantined in his home with 4 children. Can you imagine this quarantine having 4 children at home? I have 2, and it's nearly impossible right now. So Matti, the last question is, do you have plans to delve any deeper into any of these characters and continue telling these stories? I mentioned before, I see this as like the most amazing series. I hope that there'll be a 3rd part, at least a 3rd part.
Thank you. First of all, it's an opportunity for me to say thank you to JIMENA for not just for hosting this, but for everything that you're doing. It's so important, and this is not some marginal story that needs to be told. This is maybe the most important part of the Israeli story, and it's a huge part of the story of the Middle East outside of Israel. So keep at it. And thank you for your compliments about these books. I didn't think of it as a series when I started writing it. I just was kind of interested, and now I realize that this is kind of if you look at the Aleppo Codex and if you look at Spies of No Country, there are connections, and there's a story that's kind of coming together in my mind about what this place is. So yes, I'll be on it again. I'm working on a different kind of project right now, but I'll be back, and I seem to blunder into these stories. I blundered into the Aleppo Codex. I happened to meet a spy from the Arab section and kind of got exposed to this incredible little world that I ended up spending years with. It will happen again, and my eyes are always open, looking for these lost stories of these Jewish communities, which I think are growing. Their importance is increasingly evident. I think more and more people understand what has been missed and are trying to fill in the missing pieces. And I hope more and more people try to collect those pieces and write about them. I'll be there doing it, I'm sure. Great.
Thank you so much. You can all watch this on our Facebook page. Again, www.jimena.org for more events like this. Take care, everyone. Stay safe and healthy.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye,
Thank you,
everybody.
Matti.